So how we build PHPBB the next generation. So who am I? My name is Michael Cullum. That's a really ugly photo of me, and that is my Twitter and GitHub. If you want to get my slides, I'll be posting them up on Twitter afterwards, so you can grab them from there. So I work on a project called phpBB, which has the worst acronym to pronounce ever invented. And we are a forum software. Who has never used PHP before or doesn't know what it's about? That is a fantastic response.
The question was put in the right way.
So PHP, just in case any of you were embarrassed to say, is a forum software, bulletin board software. And PHP powers roughly 85% of all forums. And about 25 million installations, and that's a number that we're really, really proud of. And there are loads and loads of really big websites using us, including, I'd like to draw your attention to this one in the corner, Symfony. Who has used the Symfony forum? Yay! For those of you who don't know where it is, I'm just going to give you a helping hand. So if you go up to the community on the Symfony website, and then you go to forum, there you have the Symfony forum, and you can get support there, you can comment on things, etc. So a little bit of history about PHP for you. So PHP is a very, very old open source project. A lot of people we find actually it was one of the first things that they ever started developing with, and surprising the amount of people that actually learnt to develop with PHP. The original conception of the idea of PHP was around 1999. So that's quite a long time ago. 2000, it was actually it was originally made for a guy called James Atkinson's wife, and he then decided to post it to see if anyone had any ideas, and it then gained quite a lot of traction, as you can see. So in 2001, they had PHP 1 release. PHP was absolutely awful then. We're not going to deny that. Into PHP in 2001, we had a number of different X.Y releases. So we had PHP 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. Well, PHP 1.4 was released in November of 2001. Almost as soon as PHP 1 was released, they realised how awful it was and started on PHP 2. PHP 2 was released in around April 2002. And that was then maintained for quite a long time. It was maintained until 2008. Then we have PHP 3. Who used PHP 2 here? And who has used PHP 3? So PHP 3, one thing that a lot of you that have only used PHP 2 will remember it for its security vulnerabilities. We had an interesting reputation at the time. PHP 3 has an almost spotless security reputation. We've had no major vulnerabilities. We've had no huge vulnerabilities in the past few years. We've had audits done by a company called Section 1, who are the same people who did the Symfony audit, which we contributed about €5,000 towards to help Symfony get going on that. And then so we released that in 2006, 2007, and then we realized, and then we developed. We were intending to originally develop 3.2, which was going to be our next feature release, but it didn't quite work out like that. Our next feature release, which was an X.Y release, was 3.1, and that was released in October of 2014. So that's quite a long gap, considering that in 2001 we had PHP 1.1, 1.2, 1.2, and 1.3, 1.4. So there is a lot of reasoning behind that, which I'll go on into in a minute. So with PHP 3.1, we introduced Symfony. Big cheer. Hey. We were as Jakob said earlier, we were the first project to originally announce we were using PHP, we were using Symfony and PHP, well before Drupal ever did. And however, we've also released it before Drupal did, because Drupal is taking quite a while with Drupal 8. So that was 3.1, which was released, and now looking into the future, we're looking at 3.2, when we're going to introduce even more Symfony components, etc. But I'll go into that in a minute. So the title of this talk, I specifically used the word build, and there is a difference between the word build and develop. And I don't expect any of you to read this because it's long and complex and boring. But they're dictionary definitions of the different words. And build is more about something that you've compiled, an update, whereas developing is a continuous process of adding and modifying and rebuilding. And we're not rebuilding phpBB, we're modifying it when we're producing updates to it. So we've had a few different versions that you may have heard of. phpBB 4 is probably one that you've heard quite a bit about because that was the original version that we were going to include Symfony in. It was going to be completely rebuilt on Symfony Fullstack. But it didn't quite happen like that, and all of these versions that are up on here didn't work in the way that we originally intended. So phpBB 2.2 is the first one I mentioned. Is the first in chronological order. phpBB 2.2 was originally supposed to be a feature update to phpBB 2, the really old and secure thing that everyone doesn't like. But that then became phpBB 3.0, and the reason for that is because we accidentally rebuilt it. we had made so many customizations to phpBB that we realized that there was almost no code left. It wasn't possible to perform general updates, and we wanted to get rid of the old horrible security reputation that phpBB 2 had. So we then moved on to phpBB 3. The next feature release was then going to be phpBB 3.2, and 3.1 was going to be the development version. That's a complex Linux kernel versioning system which is a little bit odd and skips out random versions. So what we did is eventually we said, actually, hey, 3.2, why are we skipping this version? Let's just be normal people and count like normal people, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we went from, so we released 3.1, which was 3.2, but then we also released 3.1, which was also phpBB 4.0. So phpBB 3.1 was possibly 3 different versions, depending on how you could possibly view it. Now our new version cycle goes much more natural way, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4. But where does phpBB 4 come into this? Because you've all heard about phpBB 4. I think it was even announced on the Symfony blog way back when, before Symfony 2 was even made stable. Symfony, phpBB 4, and people say it's vaporware, but it's not vaporware, because essentially what we did is we did phpBB 4 in 3.1. So originally what we were going to do is rebuild it from scratch on Symfony Components, and then eventually we realised actually nobody really has the effort to rebuild something completely from scratch because it's so much extra work just rebuilding all the menial stuff. So what we decided to do was instead rebuild the core bit by bit, essentially as we'd done with phpBB 3. Going from, because originally I said it was originally phpBB 2.2 and we made it into phpBB 3 because we accidentally rebuilt it. So now what we're doing is we're doing that on purpose. So phpBB 3.1 was the closest we're probably going to get to a rewrite for a long time. There were a lot of back-end changes, and back-end was where we really focused on that, really focused. And 3.2 we're hoping to be a much more user-orientated release. So it's not vaporware. phpBB 4 is out there. It's just that you don't know it.
So it's vaporware?
No. Another thing that we decided to do is phpBB 3.1, as I mentioned earlier, it took a long time. It took 7 years. phpBB 2 took 3 years, and that was essentially a rebuild. So 3.1 took a ridiculously long amount of time, considering especially that it wasn't actually probably as big as phpBB 2 was. And the reason behind that was there are a few specific things that we wanted to have in phpBB 3.1 that never got developed. So we would develop all of these lovely features, which we thought, developer X thought that they'd quite like feature Y in there, and we never actually ever got onto the bits that we wanted in there. And the main crux of what we wanted to have in 3.1 was extensions. Who's used Drupal or WordPress and has developed extensions or plugins or any of that sort of thing? Yeah, so a few of you. The idea of that is it's really easy, it's just drop in, it works, you don't have to make any core modifications. In phpBB 2 we had this thing called hacks, which was slightly ironic considering its reputation. In phpBB 3 we renamed them to modifications, but essentially what they did is it was a format for you to add in files to an installation and how to change files. Now when you're changing your core files and you're expecting your board administrators to do that, it can get a little complicated, especially when they then want to upgrade to the next version using automatic updater and it says, hey, we can't do this diff. imagine Git conflicts, but for someone who has never touched PHP in their life. So we're now roughly working with time-based releases. So maintenance releases are going to be are a lot more often than they used to be, and feature releases. So 3.x releases, 3.2. We're going to have roughly a year between them. 3.1 was released, as I said, in October, November. So ideally 3.2 will probably be towards the end of this year as well. We're not putting specific dates and months on it as Symfony does, and we're in the same way as, unlike Symfony, we're not doing 6-month releases. I'll explain why in a minute. So how does a feature get from person Y's head into the core and into their product? So originally, it starts off as an idea, and I wanted to put a screenshot of our idea center, but it's actually unavailable at the moment. And essentially, the point of that is that end users. It's not funny. The idea of that is that end users can upvote and things that they like the idea of. So, for example, with 3.1, we had an idea called extensions, which was, as you can imagine, very, very popular. We had things like responsive design, etc. So that allows us to gauge what end users want without them having to post a technical specification of how to implement the feature, because you might be a board administrator that thinks, actually, hey, I'd like to be able to have a permission for this, but of course I don't know how to implement it, I don't know PHP, so how do I then suggest it? This is our bridge that we can use between that. So once it progresses from an idea and we see that it's got traction, it progresses to an RSC, request for comments or request for change occasionally. Originally, we modelled this on PHP's RFC process. I don't know if any of you have submitted RFCs or at least viewed them. So what they do is they have a wiki article, which is updated with ideas about implementation, etc. We're a forum software, so we use a forum. We tried originally having a wiki, but the thing is that if it's meant to be a request for comments, then you want all of your comments in one place. So it seems to make a lot more sense to us to have that in a forum. And then update the first post or relevant posts with information as you go along. So it's relatively easy to just see the different features. So you can see features we had in 3.1 like the contact form, templating systems, responsive layout. Once it's progressed through an RSC, which is the main place that we discuss the implementation of it, how we're going to do it, whether or not we actually want to do it technically, because the technical feasibility of something does not necessarily correlate to whether or not users want to do something or want a certain feature in phpBB, but we do try and cater towards users. We then move it onto the tracker, which then becomes a central location for gathering all the information on this, gathering links to all the different parts of the ideas, the RFCs, pull requests, etc. And here we actually organise the development of it. So I've picked out responsive design because responsive is really awesome and really modern.
Cheer.
Yeah. Okay. Fine then. And then it goes on to a pull request. So we love pull requests. So this, as I said, responsive design is one that I picked out. Generally, we have a lot more discussion than this, especially on such a huge feature. But this one was just obviously done very perfectly initially. So pull requests are a really, really important part of our development process. And the reason for that is that in the past, we've had not such a great security record, as you know. We've had problems, and not all code is necessarily completely up to scratch. And by not up to scratch, I don't necessarily mean that it's awful code. I mean that it might be missing it might be not following coding guidelines. It might be that it's missing certain things. It might be that it fails tests. So this allows us to get a nice way of review, and no developers can merge their own pull requests. So they're all merged and reviewed by someone else, and generally you end up with one person reviewing, and then another person comes to review it and merge it later on. So that second or third pair of eyes is really, really essential. And the other thing it allows us to do is to accept contributions from you guys, who will all be doing this tonight, right? Yeah? Yeah. So, and because in the past we've had a rather tower development methodology, which is where we had an SVN repository, we had a CVS repository before that. We are that old. And it was just developers. Our core developers would commit to it. At one point we had something called junior developers who would not have commit access, but they would provide patches, which is exactly what everyone else now does. So we'd have these core committers, but the thing is their code wouldn't get reviewed. It's not feasible, and it's not a good way to be able to get contributions from you guys. And that was really important for us. So pull requests are awesome. We love Travis. Travis is really awesome to us. If you speak to them, for example, when you're doing events and stuff, then occasionally they can help you out with things. If you've got errors going wrong, speak to them. Absolutely amazing when you actually speak to them, or you've got problems. One problem that you sometimes get with them is it's quite slow, especially 9 till 5 Eastern time in America. Those New Yorkers, they like developing for some reason on Travis. It's generally Ruby as well. So we do quite a lot with Travis. We don't just run standard PHP unit tests. So what we do here is we run things. So that is our build system. So when we initially create the builds and update packages, etc., we don't want to do that ourselves using diffs, etc. So we just have a build package that does it for us. So first of all, we just lint that. It has a special sniffer built in, so we run that, make sure everything's okay. Then we run these lovely commands here. So SAMI, which is a PHP doc, and it generates API documentation, which I'll mention in a minute. We have an images ICC image profiles checker, and I didn't know what ICC profiles were before I actually did this talk and was working out what these things did. But apparently it's extra color settings that can be attached to certain files. We don't want them, so we check for them as well. And then we check for file permissions on executable files, which are in develop, except in our develop folder, which is not distributed. And obviously then at the bottom we run possibly the most important one, but it's really, really long to put in a screenshot, is PHP unit. And then we have this other one, which is slightly less important because it's not actually checking your core code, it's checking commit messages. So it's checking for things like line endings. It's checking that you have things like ticket IDs actually in the thing, because what that then does is that automatically attaches your pull request and your commits to the ticket. So if you then go and look at the ticket in a year's time, then you can say, hey, look, I think this ticket caused this regression. Oh, look, here are all the commits. Here's the initial idea. Here's the RSC of the discussion as to why we did X, Y, Z. All of that is then pulled into that one central location, and this will check that for the commit message side of things. API documentation. Who has some sort of API, generated API documentation? PHP doc, PHP documenter, PHP doc2, whatever. Yeah, so a few of you. For open source projects, this is really quite important. Symfony has it. I use Symfonies quite a bit, and we have one ourselves, so that it's a lot easier to then find methods, etc. And this is generated by a program called SAMI. We then have Bamboo, who uses an Alsatian product, so Jira, Bamboo, Confluence, etc. They're quite well known, quite expensive as well. And so we run Bamboo, they run all of our builds, but that doesn't just do testing, because we have Travis for that, and Travis does pull requests and whatnot as well. So we have Bamboo, which generally which runs a lot more tests. They run all of our slow tests, which Travis doesn't run, because some of them, our tests in total can take up to 3 hours to run. We have a lot of unit tests and functional tests, etc. So Bamboo does all of the really complex hard work. And then we have also, it provides an equivalent of nightly builds, so it actually builds packages so that you can then download a built copy of phpBB. People kept requesting nightly builds, but it actually seems simpler to do this because it's always up to date with the latest branch, as opposed to having one at the end of every evening. We also have coding guidelines, and one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is my scroll bar on this page. They're quite long, and it does take quite a while to read them. Most of them are self-explanatory, but ideally the point of them is that if you do something that is not necessarily the way that we do everything elsewhere, we can point you to this document and say, can you do it this way? We do tabs instead of spaces, just saying. So the audience of phpBB is a little odd, as I was saying earlier about mods and hacks, etc. So we have board administrators who are not the most technical of people. Some of them are absolute geniuses and could develop PHPBB 5 times over from scratch, but they choose not to because they're using open source software, because that's what open source software is all about. But then we also have people who have never seen an HTML file in their life. They have downloaded PHPBB from our website. They have then uploaded it onto our hosting, onto some hosting, and they are then running their board. And one of the most important things for us is we don't want to bloat the core, because bloating the core means that you have so much extra stuff that you don't really need, and it gets in the way. It means it's extra stuff to develop. So what we do is we focus really heavily on it PHP being awesome to customize. At the end of 3.0s, when we released 3.1, we had 650 different modifications in our customization database, which is, so what people do is they submit a modification, and then we have a mod team, or now they're called the extensions team, who then validate it. So what they do is they go through your code and they check it for security vulnerabilities, coding guidelines, violations, etc. So those 650 modifications are a really high code quality. Very similar to that in the core. It's like a free sort of code validations thing, but by a real human. Security audits on your modifications. And so to avoid end users being like this, we've invented extensions. So extensions you can just drop in, click enable, it works. Hey, we don't have all of these horrible conflicts with our code when we're doing updates. We don't have to touch PHP. We can just run our board exactly as a board administrator should be, which is be there for the community. Who knows what this logo is of? Who's used Drupal? Who has heard of Backdrop? Okay, so so Backdrop was was a fork of Drupal produced probably about 6 months ago now, possibly a little bit longer. And the idea was it was a couple of core Drupal developers called Jenny and Nathan. I think Jenny was actually speaking at SymfonyCon. She was doing a keynote on communities. And they had, and their problem was that with Drupal 8 there is a huge learning curve, in their opinion, from the old developers who like changing code and like fiddling around and Symfony code. So I would assume that most people here would possibly disagree with that because you're all Symfony developers, because you're at Symfony Developers Meetup. But they do have very valid points, and that's that. And we have the exact same thing in the PHPBB community. Because we still have people who are developing modifications for PHP 3.0, despite the fact we have 3.1 released. And that's because they like the old way of doing things. They like just going in and changing code as opposed to having to use events. And you have to, and it can be a problem catering for these developers. And the only way that you can sort of try and do that is try and ease the learning curve between going from changing code to using event dispatches, etc. So we had this new way of thinking a little while back, which was, as Jakob said, round about the time Symfony 2 was developed. And that's we wanted to modernize PHPBB. PHPBB, as I said, we accidentally rewrote it for PHPBB 3. But the problem was we didn't rewrite everything strictly. There is still code in PHP right now that was built in 2001, I would wager a fair amount on. So obviously that's quite a problem, because in 2001 everyone developed very, very differently. Very spaghettily, and not using modern techniques. I'm just going to leave it there before I insult anyone. So this new way of thinking meant that has anyone heard of the island or getting off the island?
Very much in Drupal world.
Yeah. Larry Garfield?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Larry Garfield especially talks about getting off the island, and this is sort of one of the ideas of phpFig, Framework Interoperability Group. And the idea is that all of these little projects like PHPBB, Drupal, we used to work in our own little bubbles, developing our own stuff for absolutely everything. Drupal, up until a year ago, had one third-party library in it at all, and that was something to do with their updater. Nothing particularly special. They had their own everything, and so did we. The only part external stuff that we had in was a little bit of BB code parser, I believe. So the idea of getting off the island means things like sharing code, using projects like Symfony, and Composer did wonders for this, and it really did help us get off the island. Because what it does is it provides these bridges between these islands. And it means that, you know, we can share code, we can work together on this project. And that's really, really important, because two projects working on something is obviously going to be better than just one project working on something. Not to mention the fact that if I'm developing a database abstraction layer and Drupal is developing a database abstraction layer, and some guy who would be using Zend is developing a database abstraction layer, then you're repeating yourself unnecessarily when you could just use one database abstraction layer, such as Doctrine. So a romance then formed. This is going to be a love story. So all go Composer here is the Cupid. It's setting up projects together. So of course it's PHP Talk. So PHP Talk is going to be one of the two people, and the other is Symfony. So Symfony was gradually growing. Symfony 1 was quite big, but it wasn't hugely big, not as big as Symfony 2 is now. But with Symfony 2, Symfony was getting so much bigger. And then phpBB noticed that Symfony was getting bigger. And its big red heart started beating. And phpBB fell in love with Symfony. So at that point, we decided that it would be a good idea to use Symfony for phpBB 4 at that time. Because it meant that we could reuse a lot of the stuff that we previously developed ourselves. And it would mean that our application by default was modeled in a nice way in an MVC structure. And in PHP 3.1 Asterisk, which was released, as I said earlier, in end of October, beginning of November, we released 3.1 Asterisk with Symfony. Well before Drupal got there. I think they're still in beta. So 3.1 was mostly back-end stuff, but we integrated a lot of Symfony components, and a lot of the work was we did in 3.1 was preparatory, was more preparation for then going into to be able to do more user-oriented features. So extensions was one big thing. That's essentially for developers to develop extensions for then customizations for the users' boards. And this was probably one of the most important things we had in Asterisk. We also had a security audit done again, so we did not go back to the days of PHP 2, etc. And we were really proud of this because it took us 7 years. So what are we actually using? You're all here for Symfony Meetup, so let's hear about some Symfony, because you've heard about RabbitMQ and you've heard about phpBB, but you want to hear about Symfony, don't you? So the event dispatcher. This was the first component that we actually introduced into phpBB, and it was, who's heard of Igor Wilder? Swiss guy, invented YOLO. I hope you've all heard of YOLO. YOLO is the most awesome framework. Sorry, Symfony. So we invented, and we brought in the event dispatcher primarily because of the slow development of 3.1, which was caused by the fact that we were waiting for hooks, as we then called them. Hooks have been in Drupal for a long time. They've now moved to events as well. So with the event dispatcher, we brought this in because it meant, hey, we didn't have to do it ourselves. We might actually get 3.1 done one day. Dependency injection container was the next one to come along. And the reason that we brought that in was primarily because we were having problems unit testing. I'm sure most of us here have used an old legacy application and tried to integrate tests with it, and struggled hugely because it has the word global everywhere. I'm sure if you did Control-Shift-F on phpBB for global on 3.0 Olympus, you would find hundreds, if not thousands, of iterations of it. And that is just really, really ugly and really hard to deal with. Then we found that these new extension things were really awesome. You could just like drop them in, you had events, you didn't have to customize core code. But there was one problem, and that's that they couldn't actually have any pages. So if you wanted to have a blog extension, then you would have had to have put the blog inside a page, which you obviously don't really want to do. You want to have a blog page on your PHP forum. So we introduced controllers, which they could then use. And of course, we thought, hey, we're moving over to Symfony, so we'll use Symfony-related stuff. So we then introduced routing, or routing if you're an American, HTTP kernel and HTTP Foundation. And this was really important to us and this was a huge step, because whilst we haven't actually converted over current pages, actually in phpBB itself to the controllers, this is something that we're definitely going to be looking at doing in 3.2 and into the future. Any new features can be developed using these wonderful controllers. And of course, all extensions are pre-built using this wonderful new code. So we're encouraging good standards with our new extension developers as well. So then we had, as part of that, we then introduced a Symfony request. Until a few days ago, we introduced a request class in 3.1, but this was right at the beginning of 3.1. So we're talking back in sort of 2010, 2009. And I initially thought this was actually built using the Symfony request class, but apparently it's not. We'll be certainly looking into possibly moving that onto Symfony request, but we're definitely using this in the controllers. But we also use our own request class, so we're definitely going to be looking at consolidating that sort of thing. Console component. We had a problem with phpBB, and that's that to be able to do things like run database updates, you actually have to physically go to a URL and start clicking buttons. Now, that's horrible for an automated deployment system. So, for example, our Area 51 test site, that updates from the core phpBB repo, I think it's every hour or something like that. So, grabbing those changes is wonderful, but the problem is if it's got database changes, then you have to have someone there waiting for that hour to then press that button to then update the database, because otherwise you're going to start throwing errors. So we then integrated a whole load of things into our console. So you can list a bunch of cons. I use this one because it looked quite pretty. But you can upgrade, migrate your database. You can update assets versions. You can clear the cache, etc. And that's aimed at more developers, but anyone can use it. And you can go in with a client website, and it means that you can set up an automated deployment solution, and then you don't need to touch it. You don't need to tell them, hey, occasionally you might need to run this thing, because they don't want to be doing that. You're the people who are supposed to be doing that, because you're being paid to do it. But now you don't have to be paid to do it, because it's doing itself. We also moved, when we introduced the dependency injection container, we introduced configuration, so using things like using YAML files, etc. And into the future, we'll be looking at doing more with that. Routing with controllers, etc. Again, all done with this. And we're looking to move more configuration towards using YAML. We have some back-end configuration and parameters and stuff. So, for example, if you want to set the dependency injection container to recompile on every page load, which would make it very slow, then you can do that using settings in this parameters .yml file that we have. Because you don't really want an administrator to accidentally enable that and then find that every single page on their website is taking 20 seconds to load. Twig. This is something I advocated quite a bit within our moving over to things, and it's not strictly Symfony, but it's Symfony ecosystem, and we are using the Twig bridge bundle, which is part of a series of bundles like Monologue bundle, etc. We don't use Twig syntax though. What we did is we developed Alexa. Has anyone used Twig with Alexa for custom templating syntax? Yeah. So it's a bit ugly, isn't it? Yeah. So what we did is people thought, actually, hey, this is a big change. We're going to have to rewrite every single style. We don't really want to have to rewrite every single style just because we're changing over to templating syntax, and we couldn't convince people that that would be a worthwhile way of doing things. Drupal had a lot easier time convincing people because they were still using PHP templates before they moved to Twig. So it was a lot easier for them. We already had our own templating syntax. So we use Twig as our back-end templating engine, but we still have our actual templating files written in our own syntax. We use a series of different testing components for our functional tests and unit tests and whatnot, but not necessarily related to this. And finally, our actual file system abstractions. So we use the Finder component and the file system component. I actually don't like Mac, so it was quite painful for me to put that on there, so I really hope you appreciate it. finally, we had put our website onto Symfony, and whilst most of you don't care about this, I'm in charge of the phpBB website, so I do. And this was deployed around 2 years ago. So this was deployed well before 3.1 was actually used in phpBB, in a phpBB release that everyone else could use. So for any of you who are good at counting, that's 16. 16 components. And yes, it took us 7 years, but the first component that we actually integrated and actually did the code for would probably only have been about 2011. So in 3 years, we integrated 16 components. Drupal used 9.
Not that it's a competition.
Not that there's a competition, of course. I actually get on very well with the Drupal folks, and we collaborate on a few things, but that makes me proud. So we've got a lot of components, but hey, we want more. So we've got quite a few RSCs in the making, and hopefully they'll make them into 3.2. If not, then we've always got 3.3 and onwards. So extensions, this isn't strictly related to Symfony, but it's what we want to do is all the extensions, styles, language packs, even smileys, we want to be able to download them from your phpBB installation. We want you to be able to type in Michael's really cool blog mod, and extension rather, and then just click install, and then we wanted to go and grab it from phpBB.com, install it on your board, and hey, you have a blog. So instead of having to then go to phpBB.com, download it from the customization database, upload it onto your board using the file system, because you still have to use FTP, which is that's a learning hurdle for some people. You know, whilst we might do that on a daily basis and think, oh, that's really easy, you know, I even use SSH to do it because I'm really fancy. But there are some people that actually struggle using FTP, and we do have problems using people with FileZilla with odd settings. You know, whether or not they're adding their FileZilla is actually changing line endings or changing encoding, which is really quite problematic occasionally. Another thing that we're working on is a form builder, and therefore the validation component. So we can build forms within the back end as opposed to having to have it all in the front end. So we can have automatic CRSF protection. We don't have to consider that every single time we build a form. When people externally contribute, they might not necessarily know that you have to have open curly brace s underscore form token curly brace at the end, because that's not necessarily something you think of when you're thinking, hey, I just want a submit button there. So that's another thing we want to add in. Improving our debugging, so things like the var dumper. Obviously you don't want the var dumper in a production environment, but I'm sure that in a local environment it's quite helpful. I've used it a few times since it's been introduced. But you've also got stopwatch. So we have debug. If you enable debug, then it gives you some statistics about how long certain parts of your application took to load. But it doesn't tell you much about that. It just tells you how long individual SQL queries took, how long all SQL queries took, and how long the page took. So that doesn't really narrow down any parts of your application. So you have to then use something like Blackfire or Quafu Profiler to look at that. And we use Quafu Profiler, which is a really nice profiler, but I should be plugging Blackfire because otherwise he'll tell me off afterwards. So another thing we want to do is that this RSC was produced on the 18th of January. So the date today currently is the 21st. So this was 3 days ago, and we're still looking at introducing things. The others are slightly older. And actually, if I go back, a lot of these aren't all just by me. So there is one by me, one by a guy called Nathan, who is a former team member, another one by me, and another guy called he's called Tristan. So it's not just like it's two people within this phpBB community that are saying, hey, we should use Symfony. It's widely accepted throughout the development teams, the community, that hey, Symfony is a good thing. And I think that Drupal is gradually sort of seeing this adoption as well, although apparently not with the backdrop people necessarily, but that's for different reasons. And Tristan, in an effort to improve relations, I believe is actually starting working at Sensio. So pretty awesome. So monologue, again, not necessarily a specific Symfony thing, but it's part of the Symfony ecosystem. We'll then be using the branch, the integration bundle for it. Doctoring database abstraction layer. Currently we use our own custom one. But there's no real need to. We don't use anything specific on there. There's nothing really phpBB about it. It's just simply that when we originally developed it, there wasn't anything else. We were still very much in our own little island, in our own little bubble. So that's certainly something we can work on. And then we want to produce an API because this is something, it's quite an obvious thing to have in an application, but we don't have it at all in phpBB. If you want to create a mobile app that grab stuff from phpBB, you would have to actually grab the pages, crawl the pages, and then scrape them and process the data from that, which is a really ugly way to do things, especially if they then decide to change their style. So we want to introduce a JSON API, which would then probably end up using things like a serializer component. I mentioned earlier about Twig and about the fact that we use Alexa, but using Alexa is really ugly, as you know. And so what we want to do is, if we develop any new styles in the future, they'll be using Twig, especially into the future looking at 3.2, 3.3. We want to eventually abandon our old templating syntax. We're not stuck in the past. We want to move forward. We want to migrate. We want to press forward with innovation. We're not quite Apple yet, though. So those different things, we want to still extend them. So we want to move controllers. So at the moment, one of the release managers is working on moving a whole load of pages, like FAQ pages, over to using controllers. YAML, our config.php file, which contains things like database passwords, etc. We want to move that over to YAML, but that's quite a technical difficulty because you then have to convert that config.php file when they run the update process. So that's the current technical challenge for that. And then we want, as I said earlier about the request class, it would be nice if we could move that over to Symfony and for the whole application as opposed to just the controllers parts. So I love numbers. So 24. Anyone can guess what 24 is? Well, that too. So if we integrated all of those components into phpBB 3.1, then into 3.2, we would have 24 components. And there are 29 components in Symfony. So earlier I said about 4.0 would be built on Fullstack Symphony. So that would use every single Symfony component. But we're already accidentally doing this. And that's just simply by integrating every single component one by one. Or occasionally a few when you integrate things like controllers. But we're still building it up one by one. But eventually we will get to the stage where essentially we're built on full stack. We're just not necessarily using Symfony Standard Edition. And because we plan to release this towards the end of the year, that means that Drupal 8 might just about be being released, so they'll still have 9 components. Sorry. So of course, all of you now want to go and get involved with phpBB. You want to go out and develop more with it. You want to do something with it. So that's our Get Involved page. So I have to plug it, okay? And that's our GitHub repository if you want to have a look at code samples for anything that I've mentioned. It's relatively easy to find. Any questions? It has to be from the Drupal guy.
So I haven't used Drupal in quite some time, but the last time they were talking about, you mentioned before about hooks and the event dispatcher. Now Drupal 8, I think they decided in the end to go with a hybrid because otherwise all the modules were just going to die.
Yep.
Did you, and that was to preserve the modules. Now you've got all these mods. Have you decided just to draw a line under it and go, look, from now on you have to use an event dispatcher?
Okay, so you've obviously never modded phpBB. The problem is that in phpBB 3.0, we had 3 hooks.
Right.
Of which one was in sessions. They were all in really random locations, and they were designed more for something if anyone ever wanted to create a authentication bridge. But the thing is, because phpBB code wasn't necessarily built for that, it still didn't really help you. There were ways to hack it in. So for my blog extension, blog mod that I had for 3.0, I managed to sort of hack into the session one, and then from there I set some template variables so that I could then have something in the header of every single page, so therefore I didn't need to edit any PHP files, core PHP files. But nobody really used them unless you were a team member and you knew the PHP core really, really well. I think I've only ever seen them used a couple of times. But the hooks actually still work in 3.1. There are only 3 hooks, and the hook handler file is only about 50 lines of code. So it's not a huge amount to maintain. We'll probably drop it at some point in the future. But there was no reason to break that backwards compatibility. No effort to maintain. Nobody. But saying that, nobody's really using it. But yeah, so Drupal's way to for those who don't know, Drupal, what they did is they said, hey, we're going to leave the hooks in, but any new modules, etc., should be using events. And if you're not using these were the exact words that I read in a blog article this morning. If you're not able to use events, then you're probably developing it wrong, I think were the words. And Larry Garfield. So if you're they chose a good way of doing it, which meant that it wasn't breaking too much backwards compatibility, but yet they were still providing new functionality. So I think theirs was a good way to do it. For us, it's a slightly different situation because of our lack of usage of hooks. Any other questions?
So what are the components that you're not using at the moment that you'd like? You said about the form and things, but you said that by the end of the next release it will be. You still have a few left?
So yeah, we'd still have a few left. That's a very good question. And I don't have a list of the components with me. So things like translation, ICU, Intel, we wouldn't be using them, but simply because they don't match the sort of thing. They don't do the sort of things that we want them to do. And the way that we handle language packs is slightly odd because of the way that we accept language packs from translators. And we want to make that keep that really easy. So there's no way for us to easily migrate to the translation stuff. And to be honest, there's no real need to, because that stuff works quite well on its own. And I think one of the most important things you have to understand is when to use a Symfony component and when not to. So the blog post that I mentioned just now that was written by Larry Garfield that said about tests. One of the other things he said in it is that they actually used Zen's XML parser for feeds, and he said something along the lines of, "Wait, what? We're using Zen? I thought we were using Symfony." And he was making an important clarification that just because you're using one framework and one ecosystem doesn't mean that you can't use another as well. While some things are designed for your needs, not everything is. Some people, why else would we have multiple different forum softwares? Some things suit one person more than they do suit another. We've got Joomla and Drupal. And then you've got WordPress, which is like a blog, but it works but loads of people use it as a CMS and stuff. So it's one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's a really important thing to consider about your components. I'm kind of avoiding your question right now about which components we're not using because I can't remember them all. Yeah, you should go on Jeopardy if you know them all on SymfonyCon, because there's a round about Symfony components, and generally people fail it. Any other? Yes.
Regarding the API, have you decided to use something like Hypermedia, or have you made any sort of decisions as to?
I'm personally not working on it. I can't remember who is working on it, so I can't even point you in the direction of necessarily the right person. I could point you in the direction of an IRC channel you could ask in. Hashtag phpBB-dev. But I think the idea is, I don't even think they've made specific decisions on whether or not they're going to be throwing out XML or JSON or anything like that. I don't know if any significant work has been, I don't think any significant actual code has been produced. I think it's just been a lot of implementation details discussion. With the actual, it became quite clear that it wasn't going to make it into 3.1, and therefore I think it was put on the back burner for a bit. And we had quite a busy month in December. I don't know if any of you know why. Oh, okay. I'm not going to mention it. It's slightly embarrassing. But okay, I've mentioned it now. We were compromised in the middle of December, and we were then down for a few weeks. Hence, so not much work got done. So things have been on the back burner, but I think it's definitely something that's going to be revived. But I don't think it's been worked on actively recently for that reason. But there's definitely been a lot of discussion with regards to it. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever had problems with components updates?
Sorry.
Have you ever had problems with components updates?
Component updates. So we use Symfony 2.3. Now, the problem with that is that we released 3.1 in October of last year, and 2.3 is supported for security updates. Is it smashed? Oh, that's no fun then. So it's supported for security updates until I think about 2017-ish. So obviously we might then have a problem with regards to how long we want to support 3.1 for. We haven't necessarily worked that detail out. But because we're, sorry?
I would just recommend trying to update as soon as 2.7 is released.
Yeah, so
put a backwards compatibility layer in there so that
yeah.
It would be fairly easy to update between the major releases.
So this is, this is what Drupal are going to be doing, because they commented that they're going to be updating to a new they're going to be updating to Symfony 3. I think they said actually in a X.Y release. I think this was a recent announcement that, or I might be confused, but they're definitely going to be updating within minor releases as opposed to releasing a whole new Drupal 9, because Drupal 9 is not going to be ready in a couple of years. They haven't even finished Drupal 8 yet. So that wasn't a plug, sorry, that was just a statement. So I guess we'll see, cross that bridge when we get to it. But ultimately there shouldn't be much of a huge backwards compatibility difference, but the thing is we haven't been updating components, we've been sticking with LTSs. For 3.2 we will then be upgrading to 2.7 because 2.7 will probably be out by then, because 2.7 is November this year I believe, so we'll be up running that on that. Did I see someone else with their hand up? Oh, sorry, yes.
Discussing Drupal, how much does user base overlap with Drupal?
Sorry?
How much do your board administrators also use Drupal for?
So when we went to OSCON a couple of years ago, every other person that came up and spoke to us was asking if there was a bridge between phpBB and Drupal. So apparently it's quite a popular thing. But the reason I keep mentioning Drupal is because I feel very much that we're in this boat together. We're the two main projects that are actually moving to use frameworks. You've got projects like Joomla, etc., which might be in the future and are possibly looking at it. I think MediaWiki even considered it for a little bit, but they're not actually necessarily making much progress, or they haven't decided on things. Sorry? Easy Publish. Oh yeah, they use Symfony. Yeah, they use Symfony. So I mean, there are a few applications that use Symfony, but there aren't a huge number. And I just happen to know about Drupal quite a bit because I talked to the guy who brought Symfony to Drupal. So is that? Yeah.
Because I don't have user groups of both. It was just two people about both of what.
We just get on well with Drupal, ish. Any other questions? Or do you want to just go get a beer? That sounds like a good plan. I'll be posting my slides up on my Twitter, and I'm sure that Jakub or someone will retweet it, so if you want to have a look at them afterwards. Thank you for listening.
That's it for today. Just grab another beer and thank you. Thank you. Although the bar is closed now.
55 minutes total, 46